All right, where we left off, I had introduced Ernst Mayer's basic model of allopatric speciation and raised the idle question if there's cases where we could ever observe it in real time. And the answer is yes, and this is one of them. In 1964, someone collected some segmented worms called clamworms. Fairly common and actually used for bait a lot. If you ever go, fishing off the pier in California, and fairly easy to raise in an aquarium. So a population of clamworms was collected in 1964 and raised in a lab. In 1986, 4 pairs of those worms were transported across the country, founding a population at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, one of the great places in the world to study marine biology. And then some researchers tried to crossbreed the Woods Hole population with worms from the original site, and the crossbreeding failed. First of all, what happened was that males refused to take care of hybrid eggs, because in this species, males build these tube-shaped nests and incubate the eggs. They'll sit on top of them and they fan them to keep oxygen going to them, and they clean them to keep fungi from growing on them. Males would not take care of hybrid eggs. Now, you can get around that. You can put eggs in the stream of bubbles coming from an air stone, and it does almost as good a job as dad. But even when eggs were reared that way, they never developed. There's some kind of genetic incompatibility that kept those embryos from ever developing beyond a certain point. Now, the two populations of worms don't look any different from each other. But this happens in nature. There's lots of cases of what we call cryptic species that can't be told apart by looking, but that don't interbreed. I gave you the example of the Carolina chickadee around here and the black-capped chickadee north of St. Louis. They look virtually identical, but males sing different songs, and the two do not recognize each other as potential mates. So there's virtually no interbreeding going on between them. Another example you could see around here, if you looked in the right place, is eastern and western meadowlarks. Also another group of birds where the eastern and the western don't interbreed, but they're almost impossible to tell apart. Gesundheit. Now, here's the thing. For the biological species concept to work, it depends on what we call reproductive isolation, which is simply the inability for two populations to interbreed. And there's several different ways in which reproductive isolation is enforced. And we can talk about both pre-zygotic and post-zygotic isolation mechanisms. And it's just what it sounds like. A zygote is a fertilized egg. Pre-zygotic isolation is anything that can happen before Mr. Sperm meets Mrs. Egg. Post-zygotic isolation is everything that happens after fertilization. So you can get behavioral isolation mechanisms in which individuals don't interbreed because the mates simply have different recognition behaviors. If there's a male bird going chirp, 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 and a female who only gets in the mood if she hears tweet, 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 then you would have behavioral isolation. The two might never interbreed. This is what happens in the case of those chickadees and the meadowlarks that I talked about. They don't interbreed because the males of each one have distinctive songs. In temporal isolation, individuals might not interbreed because they would mature at different times. If one plant is producing pollen only in March, and the other plant is not producing flowers with fertile eggs inside until June, then the two are very unlikely to ever interbreed. You can have ecological isolation when individuals don't interbreed because they're in different niches. If you've got one lizard living way up in the crown of a tree and another living down on the ground, they're highly unlikely to ever interbreed simply because they're occupying different niche space. And then gametic isolation, you can have individuals that fail to interbreed because there's some kind of biochemical incompatibility between gametes. You get this a lot in marine organisms that shed eggs and sperm freely into the water. The eggs and sperm often have receptor proteins on their outer membranes that enable them to recognize each other. And if a sperm tries to fertilize an egg but doesn't have the correct receptor proteins, that sperm just may never be able to do it. So some kind of chemical incompatibility between gametes, or sometimes incompatibility between gametes and parental tissues. I don't know if you remember this, but when a pollen grain lands on a stigma, it begins growing a tube that pushes its way through the female tissues down to where the egg cell actually is. And if there's some kind of incompatibility between the female tissues and the pollen tube just may not grow. So that would be another case of gametic isolation. I think my favorite example is mechanical isolation. And I've already alluded to this in a previous lecture. In many insects and crustaceans and other arthropods, male and female sex organs have very complicated shapes. I believe I've already mentioned that sometimes the only way to identify separate species of insect is to examine the genitalia very carefully, because they can have very distinctive, rather complicated shapes. They can have various attachments on them. And the male and female organs fit like a key into a lock. And in some cases, different species cannot interbreed because they simply can't fit into each other. There have been cases observed where if a male of one species attempts to hybridize with the female of the other, his genital appendage just breaks off and is left stuck in the female. Which pretty much puts an end to the reproductive careers of both of them, right? She can't mate because she's permanently blocked up by this strange male's tallywhacker. I love biology. So yeah, that sort of thing can happen. So you can have mechanical isolation where it's simply not possible for male appendages to enter the female in the appropriate way. And then post-zygotic isolation is due to anything that happens after the sperm and the egg unite. You can have zygote mortality, where the egg is fertilized, but it can't divide or can't develop any further. And the zygote would simply die. Or you could have the embryo that will stop developing at a certain point and eventually die. You can get a frog egg to go through the first few cell divisions simply by poking it with a dirty needle. That's actually been known since at least the 1920s. The first few stages of development are basically pre-programmed into the egg cell, and it won't be it takes several divisions for the DNA of the male parent to activate. So you would fertilize a frog egg with almost any sperm and it would at least begin developing. But if the paternal DNA is not the right source, development will come to a screeching halt at I think maybe the 8th or the 16th cell stage, and it will go no further. So that would be a case of embryo inviability. In hybrid sterility, embryos might develop into adults, but the adults might be unable to breed. So for example, the classic one is horses and donkeys, which can interbreed and they produce mules, elegant and beautiful animals, Missouri nightingales, as they used to call them back in the day, but mules can't breed. Horses and donkeys have different chromosome numbers. I think horses have 66 and donkeys have 64. Could be wrong about it. I could have it backwards, but it's one or the other, meaning that a mule has 65, meaning that if a mule tries to carry out meiosis in its ovaries or its testes, the eggs and the sperm are not viable because they get the wrong chromosome number, right? Because you can't divide 65 evenly, so some chromosome does not pair up properly at meiosis. You could also have reduced hybrid fitness, in which hybrids may survive, but they may be very poorly adapted. They may be physically weak. They may be prone to die. They may be viable, but they may simply be strongly selected against. So thus the difference between prezygotic and postzygotic isolation. And if you have two populations that hybridize, but the hybrids have low fitness, then natural selection should favor any mechanism that decreases the incidence of hybridization. We already talked about this as a possible mechanism for mate choice in sexual selection. Basically, any individual that hybridizes will not pass on its genes, or not very well. Any individual that doesn't hybridize has a much better chance of passing on its genes. So natural selection should favor any gene that influences individuals to mate with their own species and not hybridize. The idea is that if you have this, where you have two populations that hybridize, but there's selection against the hybrids, the two species should become more different from each other as time goes by. So once populations are partly separated, natural selection, in theory, should drive them apart further and make them more and more unlike each other, less and less likely to interbreed. And we call that reinforcement. It's also called the Wallace effect. You might remember I mentioned way back when that Alfred Russel Wallace tends to get glossed over as the guy who played second fiddle to Darwin, but was a very good scientist in his own right and came up with some important contributions. This is one of them. And here's what looks like a good example of it. On the left is a collared flycatcher. I think this is a European bird. And on the right is a pied flycatcher. And they overlap in range, but they rarely hybridize. And when they do hybridize, the females are sterile. The female hybrids are. So think about this. If you're a collared flycatcher and you have genes that really give you the hops for a pied flycatcher, you'll produce hybrid offspring and half of them will never reproduce. If you're a collared flycatcher and you have the hops for another collared flycatcher, you'll have offspring and all of them potentially can reproduce. So collared flycatchers that love to mate with other collared flycatchers should have double the fitness of collared flycatchers that love to mate with pied flycatchers. And collared flycatchers that clearly can state, "Hi there, I'm a collared flycatcher," are likelier to leave offspring than collared flycatchers that are more like, "Well, I could be collared or I could be pied, I don't know, whatever, hey, it's all good. I'm up for anything." So anyway, where the two overlap, the species are more different from each other. than where the species are found separately. In the zone where they overlap, it is advantageous for males to clearly display, hey, I'm a collared flycatcher. And it's advantageous for females to clearly prefer, hey, I only get the hots for collared flycatchers. So it's what it looks like is going on is we've got selection against hybrids, and where they overlap, it's tending to make these species more different from each other. That's speciation by reinforcement. Once speciation's gone a ways, it should become a self-perpetuating process if the species are so different that hybrids are selected against. And you can, of course, have several of these barriers at once. Up above, that's a good old domestic cat, Felis domesticus, otherwise known as the household chaos demon. Down below, that's a serval. That's a small wildcat native to Africa. The Little Rock Zoo has a couple, or at least they did the last time I was there. So you could go out and see a serval. There are people that do keep them as pets, although, yeah, you can domesticate them, but you never do fully train them. And I am told that, like a lot of exotic pets, they will utterly wreck your house unless you've got a huge amount of space for them and, you know, can afford a raw meat diet and things like that. Anyway, sorry?
My boyfriend's cousin has a serval.
Okay.
In an apartment.
Does the serval seem happy?
I mean, he like sleeps on their bed with them. He's pretty nice to them, but they've had him since he was a kid. You know, strangers he hides from. He avoids people, and if you get near him, he'll like hiss at you. And they feed him like chicken, they'll put chicken and stuff and put it in his bowl. As soon as you put it down, it's like he's like he's eating, like
Right.
he's guarding his food and showing his fangs. Yeah. We're feeding him chicken just to kind of keep his wild instincts suppressed.
Okay, so yeah, you can domesticate them, but I don't think you can ever truly train them.
He got out once.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Well,
He looks pretty mean though.
okay.
I wouldn't touch him.
Somebody tried, well, I guess the worry there is if your exotic pet gets out and, you know, somebody freaks out and screams there's a wild animal on the loose, you know, the cops might shoot him instead of trying to recapture him. That would be a concern.
Yeah, they paid like $6,000.
Oof. Anyway, so a few years back, somebody tried breeding domestic cats with servals. And the mating was very difficult because servals often refuse to mate with domestic cats. So there's behavioral isolation. You know, domestic cats evidently don't behave right or don't smell right or something like that. The gestation periods are different. It's longer for servals, and that can create problems in pregnancy. And hybrid litters were often born prematurely or aborted, or in some cases reabsorbed back into the mother's body, which people can't do, but a number of mammals can. I know rabbits can, and evidently cats can as well. They can just absorb their offspring if they're not developing right or if mom is nutritionally stressed.
Can human twins do that?
Yeah, you can have twins, and then one twin can end up engulfing the other. And you can end up with a person that's a chimera. I know somebody who is socially female and probably anatomically female, although I've never checked real closely because we're not that kind of friend. But she found out on after medical testing that she is in fact a chimera. Some of her cells have 2 X chromosomes and some of her cells have an X and a Y. Meaning that presumably she was apparently one of a pair of fraternal twins and they ended up fusing.
Girl I went to school with always claimed she had like this skin tag, like birthmark on her name. She was like, "That's where I ate my twin." She always said that she had a twin.
It's possible. This is rare, but there have been people, a lot of them used to make careers as, circus freaks in the early 20th century, where you'd have a person who might have 4 legs, one pair of legs, and then a second pair growing out of a random spot. And that second pair is basically all that's left of a twin that had been absorbed. It's like Siamese twins taken even farther. It happens. It's one of those things. Anyway, I digress. So we consider domestic cats and servals to be separate species. In fact, they're considered separate genera. And if you hybridize them, you have both prezygotic and postzygotic mechanisms that discourage hybridization. And yet, when this was tried several times, now and again, you would get fertile F1 hybrids. And the fertile F1 hybrids are still a little bit too wild for your average pet owner. So the fertile F1s got crossed with domestic cats. So you get an F2 that is 3/4 domestic cat and 1/4 serval. Or an F3 that is 7/8 domestic cat and 1/8 serval. And F3 and F4 hybrids are enough like regular cats. The average pet owner can keep them. And yet they've got that beautiful spotted coat and that slightly wild appearance that a lot of people like. Some people like exotic looking cats. And this is the origin of the Savannah cat. This is a recognized breed. Gesundheit. That consists of a typical Savannah might be 7/8 domestic cat, but have 1/8 genes that derive from a serval great-grandparent. So do we have one species here, or do we have 2? Should we consider domestic cats and servals to be different species? Well, they look very different. They've got very different habitats, different diets, different home ranges, different behaviors. And yet it is possible to create domestic cats that have some degree of serval blood in them. So do we have 1 or 2? Incidentally, this is a Bengal cat, and this was created the same way. Domestic cats were hybridized with an Asian species called the leopard cat, Prionolorus bengalensis. And then you take the hybrids and back cross them with domestic cats for a couple of generations. And you have an animal that's the size of a domestic cat that is well enough behaved that your average cat owner can care for it. And yet has that beautiful wild type striped and spotted coat and just enough wild behaviors to stay very interesting. Apparently, these cats are absolute champions at leaping and climbing. They can jump as high as your head. Yeah, you want to keep them off the furniture. Good luck with that. They can get anywhere. But they are apparently sweet, loving, and social, and do not growl at strangers or hide under the bed, or at least no more than domestic cats do. What's that?
So you think my cat was serval? She's mean.
Oh, yeah. We had one. I'm afraid we think the coyotes got her. She's not with us anymore. Beautiful cat. But when she was a kitten, she had a broken leg which had healed, and mom had rejected her. So that cat had issues. Like any attempt to pet her was met with all 4 sets of claws and teeth. When she was a kitten, she would just walk into the room and just suddenly see my foot and decide, this must die, and endeavor to kill my foot. She mellowed out a little bit, but never did quite. Anyway, we call this introgression. That's another one of those savanna cats with the spotted coat. When you have DNA from one population or one lineage or one species that works its way into the gene pool of a second one, we call that introgression. So what we've got is the savanna cat is a domestic cat with some introgression from certain. And the Bengal cat would be a domestic cat with some introgression from Asian leopard cat. And we now think this happens more often than we think, and it can actually be a source of genetic variation. That individuals may not vary just because they've got mutations. They can vary because some of them might have DNA that ultimately descended from what we used to call a different species. Here's an example in the wild. Polar bears and brown bears, ecologically very different. Polar bears live in the water most of the time. Brown bears live on land. Brown bears will eat lots of plant and insect food in addition to meat. Polar bears are exclusively carnivorous. They are one of the few species that considers humanity as prey. Like will naturally try to predate on humans given the chance. Ecologically different, physically they look different, and yet in zoos, they've hybridized and the offspring have been fertile. There was actually a finding about 20 years ago in the early days of DNA sequencing, when someone sequenced some DNA from some southeastern Alaska islands of bears that looked like grizzlies. The islands are called the ABCs. I think that's the Admiralty Islands, the Baranov Islands, and the Chichagof Islands, but for short we'll call them the ABC Islands. And grizzlies from the ABC Islands had DNA sequences that were more like polar bears than they were like other brown bears. So what the heck is going on here? The latest is that polar bears and brown bears have distinct nuclear genes, which implies that they split about 600,000 years ago. That's when the population that gave rise to polar bears mostly separated from the population that gave rise to brown bears. You get that when you look at nuclear DNA. The problem is that mitochondrial DNA does not give you the same picture. Think about this for a minute. Your nuclear DNA comes from both parents, right? Yes, correct? You got half your nuclear DNA from mom and half from dad, and you'll pass on half of yours to any offspring that you ever have, and the other parent will contribute the other half. We talked about this back when we were talking about haplotypes. Mitochondrial DNA is only inherited through the mother. And it turns out that polar bear mitochondrial DNA actually shares a common ancestor with that of brown bear DNA. And it looks like this. The nuclear DNA, the brown bear split off from the polar bear about 600,000 years ago. When you look at mitochondrial DNA, the last common mother of all living polar bears must have been a brown bear. Okay, so we've got evidence there for hybridization going on because we have different patterns when we do a cladistic analysis of nuclear DNA versus mitochondrial DNA. And we've had to modify this because it now turns out that brown bear lineages do have some polar bear in them. And what it looks like is happening is that brown bear males in the past mated with polar bear females. And they did it so much that in some brown bear populations, 9% of the genome is actually of polar bear origin. So there has been hybridization between brown bears and polar bears going on for a long time. So much so that there are some brown bear populations that have quite a lot of polar bear ancestry to them. And incidentally, it always seems to be brown bear males mating with polar bear females. And this seems to work because this is a species where females tend to stay close to where they're born, and males are the ones that disperse. The males go out wandering and they find new territories. And so it should be easy to see how a wandering brown bear might encounter a polar bear and think, you know, why not? And it doesn't happen the other way around. Male polar bears don't seem to have mated with female brown bears. So we have two populations that look very different. They're ecologically very different. They exchange genes, but they only do it in one direction. They only do it through male brown bears mating with female polar bears, not the other way. Huh? The big take home that I want to give from this is that this is not really surprising. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, when I was a young grad student, there used to be this evangelist on campus by the name of Pastor Glenn. I guess they haven't done this much for the past 2 years because of the pandemic, but before that, at least once a year, we could pretty much count on some roving band of evangelists coming to the UCA campus. They'd usually set up shop on the steps of the chapel. And they would just start preaching to people. And, you know, it wasn't always the same people, but they generally draw a big crowd, usually because they insulted everybody by telling them what awful sinners they were. I remember one band of them that kept claiming that, all of the men were gay and all of the women were sluts. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, we have a problem here. Like, if all the men are gay, why would the women even stick around? If the women are sluts, then they're not going to be able to find what they're looking for if the men are gay. They couldn't get their story straight. There used to be one group of them that would use the worst insults possible and try to get somebody to take a swing at them so that they could sue. But I digress. I don't know if we'll go back to that after the pandemic, but we certainly had it before, but it was maybe once a year. Berkeley used to get it every day. Berkeley has such a reputation as a crazed liberal hangout that we would get the rudest pastors you've ever heard of from uber conservative towns just on the other side of the California coastal range, who would come in and do their worst. And Pastor Glenn was actually not that bad a guy. Pastor Glenn had previously been the manager of a bar in the Castro district of San Francisco called the Ramrod. And I don't know if the name means anything to you, but the Castro district is basically the gayest gay that ever did gay. This is actually fading now that there's more mainstream acceptance, but the Castro was the gay neighborhood in San Francisco with all kinds of bars and clubs and shops, and, you know, it was quite a happening scene if you're into that. And Pastor Glenn had managed a bar that catered to men who liked men in uniform. If you had a thing for tough guys in fatigues, or cop, if your favorite one of the village people was the cop, the Ramrod was the place to go. And he'd done a complete 180-degree turn and become a campus evangelist. Whatever, either way, I don't really judge. But he'd come out and, say all of these anti-Darwinian arguments, and every so often I'd argue with him, for lack of anything more productive to do with my time. Arguing with somebody like that, because it gets to be where it kind of feels like you're trying to nail Jello to the ceiling. But one of his arguments, finally coming to the point, was if evolution was true, there'd be no way to classify living things and everything would be total chaos. To which my answer was, yes, that's the first thing you said right. If you don't actually do this sort of thing, it is easy to think that life is as simple as your Audubon field guides, where everything that you find can be put into one particular pigeonhole and classified as one species. But in a world that's been undergoing evolution by natural processes for 4.5 billion years, we should expect to see populations that are mostly separate species, but maybe not quite, and populations that are kind of separate species, but maybe kind of the same thing, but somehow they're not, but they could be. We ought to see a whole lot of edge cases and a whole lot of fuzzy cases where there is no absolute cutoff to decide whether we're dealing with one species or two. And that is, in fact, what we do find. Very important concept I want to introduce you to, and it's important in many other fields of science than this one. Sometimes the answer to the question, do we have one species or do we have two? Sometimes the only answer is, write that down, U-N-H.
U-N-H.
It's not a yes, it's not a no, it's an What it means is that the very premise of asking the question is so out of line that either a yes or a no answer is not correct. And you find it in lots of other fields than this one. Sometimes you can plan a really awesome experiment and the data that you get suggests that the whole idea of doing the experiment was misguided in the first place. Sometimes you try to ask questions with a definite answer and the answer you get is, It happens. It is a natural result of having to deal with an extremely complex world that we don't really understand very well. And we get it in questions like this: are grizzlies and polders separate species or the same species? Well, the honest answer is, all together now. Yes, louder. Are grizzly bears and polar bears the same species or are they different species? Very good. And that's what we would expect on a world that's evolving. That's one case where Pastor Glenn was absolutely right, but didn't realize it. You also have the problem that the biological species concept is not applicable to asexual organisms. Most amoebas have never been caught reproducing sexually. Maybe they do, but maybe they're so discreet about it that they've never been seen. Bacteria can sexually reproduce with essentially anything because bacteria are very good at incorporating DNA snippets from almost any source. You might well remember, Frederick Griffith's transforming principle. He mixed live bacteria of one type with dead bacteria of a second type and got live bacteria of the second type, and concluded that some sort of substance had gone from the dead to the live, and that substance turned out to be DNA. Anybody cover that? It was critical experiments back in the 1920s that are foundational for the discovery of DNA. Frederick Griffiths first clinched the case that there's some substance that makes an organism the kind of organism that it is. Well, what was going on was that the live bacteria were just picking up DNA from the dead ones. So down below, that's a couple of E. coli caught in the act of having sex. The hairy one on the left is passing a copy of a DNA loop to the one on the right. And a guy named Soren Soneo once observed that if you follow the biological species concept, there's only one species of bacteria because bacteria can bacteria trade pieces of DNA like kids trading Pokemon cards. We can genetically engineer bacteria to express genes from anywhere. In fact, back in the 70s, that was a major breakthrough when bacteria first became engineered to create human insulin. But we're not doing anything radically that's against nature, because live bacteria in the wild can pick up DNA and sometimes they incorporate it into their genome. It happens all the time. So how do you apply the biological species concept to something like that? To critters like amoebas that don't have sex, or to critters like bacteria, which are basically able to have sex with anything in the environment? Which reminds me of somebody else I knew in Berkeley, but let's not go there. And then you can have things like this. These are two birds that look very different. They live in different areas. The East USA has the eastern blue jay on the left. On the right, that's a male Steller's jay. And I used to see these guys on the Berkeley campus. You find these guys west of the Rockies. Quite attractive birds. And they live in different areas except for one small part of Colorado. And in that little hybrid zone, they overlap. And where they overlap, they can interbreed and produce fertile hybrids. So do we have one species or two? Altogether, do we have one species or do we have two? Very good. Here we've got those cryptic species I was talking about. You can't tell western meadowlarks and eastern meadowlarks apart, but they don't interbreed, and in part they've got very different songs. So those would be cryptic species. And then we get things like Kirk's dik-dik, which is always fun to say. Kirk's dik-dik. It's a small African-dwelling, forest-dwelling antelope. And all members of what we used to call the species look identical, but there's three different karyotypes, three different chromosome arrangements found within Kirk's dik-dik. And if you cross individuals with different karyotypes, the hybrid offspring are sterile, even though all Kirk's dik-diks look completely identical. So that's another case of cryptic speciation. So cherish those and hang on to those. Your examples, your cases where you can't really resolve whether you're dealing with one species or with two or with more. That's telling you something important about life on Earth. That strange ambiguity when you try to penetrate down to what really is and isn't a species is exactly what we ought to find. And on that note, I will stop the recording.